Good morning. Welcome to our monthly third Thursday IHE Lunch and Learn. Today we are very excited to have Dr. Geri Crain, who is on staff, is at Creighton University's dental school. I was introduced to Geri about 2 years ago by Lori Sullivan through just a mutual discussion they had, and we began to have this discussion about her family's story, and I was intrigued and asked at some point, when you have time, I'd love to have you as one of our Lunch and Learn speakers. And she just is from Kansas City and commutes back and forth, and was just their featured speaker for their annual Yom HaShoah commemoration. So Geri, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Scott. I really appreciate the invitation and especially this format, both live and recorded. The Yom HaShoah commemoration that I hosted was the keynote at last weekend in Kansas City. I had 15 minutes to share my parents' story and to tie it to the importance of remembrance and the importance to the relevance to today. 15 minutes. So I really appreciate having approximately an hour or so, and we'll just see how the conversation unfolds at the end. One of my favorite parts is sharing my parents' story, specifically focusing on my mother's, and then answering it up for conversation at the end. So I'll jump right in. This is a story about resilience, remembrance, and relevance. And I'll just do a quick overview of both of my parents. My mother was born Kopel Lutzi in Sighet, Romania in the spring of 1923, was taken to Auschwitz, Birkenau on one of the last Hungarian transports that came through the area. She's from that town of Sighet, which borders. They were sometimes spoke Hungarian, sometimes spoke Romanian, depending on the political winds. But her first language was Hungarian, and then they spoke Yiddish in the home. Sighet is also the hometown of Elie Wiesel, and students would ask my mother when she spoke. Students who had read Night and knew of Elie said, "Did you know Elie Wiesel?" And she said, "Elie, he was a scrawny little brother of a girlfriend of mine." So yeah, he knew, she knew of Elie. Fast forward, he became a Nobel laureate and really spokesperson for Holocaust survivors worldwide. She was taken to Auschwitz, was on the death march to Bergen-Belsen, and you can see she was taken late in the war and then was liberated from Bergen-Belsen in 1945, where she was taken to Sweden for rehabilitation. And I'll speak more about that. On my father's side, he was born Hugo Kohn in 1909. So it was Austro-Hungarian Empire at the time. He was taken, his father was killed in World War I. So his brother and he were sent to an orphanage. But their hometown was Wapfing, which is outside of Vienna. He was in Wapfing on Kristallnacht when he was taken. As you can see, he was an adult at that point in 1938. If you were taken early on in Dachau, if you could find work, a proof of employment at another country, they would release them. His sister-in-law worked very hard to find work for her husband, my dad's brother, and my dad. And his work was in Sweden. So that's a little foreshadowing of the future. They both ended up in Sweden. So in my mother's early years, this is I often include this map just to orient students in particular. You know, this is Europe, this is Romania, the very tip of that red arrow, the Sighet isn't even listed on this map. It was pretty small, but it's there along the river in the beautiful Carpathian Mountains, in literally the region where Dracula and his home, his castle is. And my mother never heard of Dracula until she came to this country. She's like, what is this Romanian? Yeah, so that's where, so that was her on the map where she was from. Her little town, Sighet, they would refer to as Little Paris. It was kind of fancy, for their era. And this is the movie house in town, and you can see on either side of the movie house there are these streets with tree-lined sidewalks, and then shops and apartments. And this was really where a lot of socializing happened, back in the day. Now, those streets you can see in this modern day photo, there are cars, but in 1923, when she was born, the town was small enough and traditional enough. There were cars later on, but they were few, and they still made their deliveries around town with horses. And so that's something that will come into play in just a moment. This is a picture of my mother and her brother, Oscar. We called him Uncle Ozzy, and their parents. And you can see the movie theater in the background. There was another brother, Zolly, and he was already in medical school at the Sorbonne in Paris. And this is a picture of my mother in the 4th grade. She was in the play as the Red Rose. Roses were her favorite flowers, always were her favorite flowers. And she loved music, dancing, singing. She had a beautiful singing voice. She had taken piano lessons. She had French lessons, English lessons. She had a little white dog named Lily. A lot of friends of not just Jewish friends, but the town was very friendly. She did have a superstitious grandmother who said, when you walk by a church, look the other way. If the doors are open and you look into a church, you'll turn to stone or something like that. But my mother just thought that's my grandmother, because her friends were non-Jewish. They just had a wonderful, wonderful childhood growing up. Now, there were no televisions, there were no no cell phones, no internet. So the way that my mother socialized with her friends were getting together after school and going on these walks. And here's a picture of my mother. She's the one in the middle, enjoying those walks with her 2 girlfriends. And you can see she's a little bit dressed up. She said they always dressed up a little because you never knew who you would see or who would see you. And they were always hoping, she was always hoping it would be a boy that she liked. So they always dressed up. And this was how her childhood and early adult years into her, let's say, early 20s, how she was enjoying life, enjoying friends, enjoying the town. Her parents never included her in conversations about politics, about discrimination, about the war. She said, I didn't even know there was a war going on. We just kept going. Here we were just keeping going. And then she said, one day the sky fell, and strange things started happening, and strange laws started to come out. And one of the first ones was that Jewish men could no longer own a business. Well, her father had a delicatessen or a store that you could buy meats and cheeses. Some of them were imported. Some of them were, he provided space to the local, I'm going to use a term that's no longer in favor, but at the time they called the gypsy population, but they were Sinta and Roma who lived in the area, and others maybe discriminated against them, but her father and mother were very open to everyone and allowed them space to share their wares, and some of the recipes that they were cooking could be purchased in the store that my mother's father owned. And when the law came that said that Jewish men cannot own shops anymore or run a business, he was the sole provider for the family and the extended family that lived in the house. And the way my mother described it was the stress was too great and he had a heart attack and died. So my mom and her mother, Granny, that means my mother's grandmother, and there was an Auntie Sarah, who lived in the house with two little cousins. They carried on. They carried on as best they could, and my mother was still going to school at that time until another law came, very strange, that said Jewish women couldn't be educated. They could not go to school any longer. And my mother thought, well, that's strange. Why not? And then she said to herself, I was never really that great of a student. So, okay, I won't go to school anymore. I'll stay home and practice my piano. And she was still taking her French lessons and English lessons and playing with her dog and wait for her girlfriends to come home so they could go continue on these walks. And then a strange law came that said Jewish people can no longer walk on the sidewalks. They had to walk in the streets. Excuse me. And she said, we had horses that went in the streets, and we all know what horses do in streets. They poop, and the streets were dirty. And here they were dressing up in their nice clothes and her nice shoes. She did not want to walk in the street and get her clothes dirty. So she stopped going on those evening walks. And that was really sad because that was her point of socializing. So she said, oh, forget it. And she stayed home. And then there was a law that came that said people who live in this part of the town have to pick up and move into houses, other people's houses in this part of the town. And they called this part of the town ghetto. And my mom's house was in that area, was in the ghetto. So other families came, and she didn't know who they were, moved into her house. And as you might know, in the ghetto, you are not free to come and go. You were there in that part of the town. There was a time when there was an order that all of the men who lived in that ghetto had to leave. And of course, Elie Wiesel and his family and all of the other men who were of able body left. They didn't know where they were taken. They didn't know what, they just knew the men were gone. And so the women, the elderly, the children, and those men who were not able-bodied were remaining in the ghetto. One day, a young boy came back who had been taken. I don't know how my mother doesn't know how he made it back into the ghetto, but he snuck back in and he said, you would not believe this. They took us and they lined us up around this huge hole in the ground, a huge pit that somebody had dug, and they shot us in our backs and we fell into the pit. He said, but I didn't get shot. They missed me. And he escaped and he hid, he escaped, and he came back to tell them this. And when he said, you are not going to believe this, guess what? They didn't believe him. This was a different time than we are used to today. Guns were not common. Shooting was not common. People didn't necessarily own guns. They didn't see movies or read books of violence necessarily, like it is more commonly, unfortunately, common for us today. So for them, it was unprecedented. It was shocking. It was hard to believe. They didn't believe him. Time went on this way. One day, a knock came on my mother's door that said, prepare yourselves. We're going to come back in 10 minutes and you have to come out on the street and line up. Well, they didn't know what for, where they were going, how long they'd been gone, but my mother's granny had just finished baking 2 loaves of bread in their brick oven that was down in their basement. So they packed up the bread. I don't know that they brought anything else with them, but other people did. When the knock came and the order came to come out and line up 5 abreast, very strict orders, 5 abreast. My mom looked around and she said she saw people with suitcases, carrying various objects and things. At this point, when I tell this story, I share this story with school children, I say, what would you bring with you if you didn't know where you were going, how long you would be there, if you would be coming back? What are your most prized possessions? What are your family's most prized possessions? Would you bring them? What would you do? So my mom joined this line with her mother and the 2 little cousins. Their mom, Auntie Sarah, was not able to come with them. She was in a hospital. She had just had a surgery. I think it was a hysterectomy, so she could not join this walking that they were on. So my mother was there with her mom and the 2 little cousins between them. They were very protective of the little ones. And they started walking. And they walked down these streets, past all of these wonderful childhood memories that she had. And she and past other townspeople. She said some people were looking out their windows. You can see how some of those windows must have looked. And they were very angrily being pushed onward and onward to the train station. And in the past, when my mother would take train rides with her mom, they would go to Budapest or Bucharest. They would take these vacations, and back then they dressed up to go on the trains. It was kind of a fancy thing they did as a family. The trains were nice, and this was not that kind of train. When they got to the train station, there were cattle cars there, very high off the ground, and it was hard to get up into them. And when they did get into them, there were no benches, there were no seats. It was just an open cattle car. And they kept squeezing more and more people into these cattle cars that were dark, except for a small window at the top that let light in, to the extent that my mother was able to track the number of days and nights that they were in those cattle cars. She counted 3 days and 2 nights. And during that time, no food, no water, And there was a bucket, so if people had to go to the bathroom, other people would hold a jacket or a blanket up around that person to have some semblance of humility. But it was a difficult, cramped, and uncomfortable position to be in, so much so that those who were not of good health or elderly, there were some people who died during those 3 days and 2 nights. Those 2 loaves of bread that they brought with them, they let the little cousins eat them. So my mother had no food, no water, but they did share the food with the little ones. On that third day, the trains that had been going constantly nonstop, on the third day, they stopped and the doors opened up and the sunlight was very bright to their eyes, and they were met by someone who said, "You have just arrived to Auschwitz. It is a work camp." When my mother heard those words, work camp, she thought to herself, you know, she was 21 years old at the time. She said, my mother used to always say to me, when you are 21, not more than 23 years old, you are supposed to get married and start to have a family. And in those moments, she thought to herself, okay, if this is a work camp, I'm going to work to survive because I need to get married and have a family. That's what my mother said. That's what we do as young girls. This is what we do as women. So they were told to come off of those cattle cars and line up on the sidewalk. You can see up to the right, there's up the grass, there was a walkway. And there were actually, the train was so long, what you see at the end of the tracks there is it's actually the entrance to Birkenau, the women's side of Auschwitz. But all trains came through those gates and the trains were very long. So people would come off the train and go up to that walkway. And somewhere along the way in that walkway was a raised wooden structure, a platform, with one man standing up there in a uniform. My mom described him as handsome. And all people were, again, lined up 5 abreast, always 5 abreast, and they were making their way toward this platform. And so when my mother's turn with her mom and their 2 little cousins came up to the platform, the man on the platform spoke no words, just pointed to the right or to the left. He pointed to my mother's mom and the 2 cousins to go to their left, and for my mom to go to her right. Well, she didn't want to go to the right. She wanted to stay with her family. So she took a step to go with them to the left. And no sooner an angry soldier on the platform with a long gun, a bayonet with a pointed knife tip on the end of the gun, he did this. He put the gun under her chin because she dared to disobey this man's orders. So she said, okay. She went off to the right. And what she learned later was this man who she dared to disobey was the infamous Dr. Mengele. And that was the last she had seen of her mom and the 2 little cousins. She went to her right through gates that led to wooden barracks. And she went into one of the wooden barracks with the other girls who came on the trip, the train with her, and they took their clothes away. And in return, they were given these gray, very scratchy dresses, ugly, gray, scratchy dresses. And then there were women with who worked there with razor blades, and they shaved their heads. And my mom used to describe looking down at the floor, and there were her beautiful brown curls all down there. And she had said to herself, no worries, I'll grow more. I can grow more. So that gives you a little bit of an insight into her mindset and a little foreshadowing of her resilience when it came to these, insults upon insults. After that preparation, they were deloused, all kinds of things were happening there. Then they took them into another wooden barrack where there were bunk beds. And women had to squeeze into multiple people per slot. It wasn't one to yourself. And there were no blankets, there were no pillows. And they still were wondering, where are we? Why are we here? What's going to happen next? And a woman who was in charge of their barrack, they called her the Blokova. She was very angry, and she was yelling at these women and saying, well, you've been home all these years of the war, because this was the spring of 1944 when they were brought here. She said, when you've been home all these years of the war, and I've been here building this place up. And my mom had no idea what she was talking about. But another girl who had come in the same transport from my mom's hometown stopped this woman who was on her rampage and said, excuse me, but did you have a brother named David? And this woman stopped in her tracks and said, why, yes, I do. How do you know? And the woman said, from my mom's hometown, said, you look there's a lot of family resemblance. And your brother David came through our town and on military, and we housed him in our house and shared meals with him and then he left. And from that moment, my mom said this Blokova, her name was Gita, she became their guardian angels. So when in the coming days, the orders came for everyone in this barrack to line up and go to work, Gita would say, not this barrack, we are in quarantine. And she meant by that for some reason there was some disease and they could, spread disease. So they're in quarantine. So then they were spared having to go to work for a long time. Now, my mother described what the daily routine was like. They would sit around and do nothing in their barracks. What she would do with her friends who had been squeezed into that cattle car at the same time, and others from her hometown, those girls, they would sit on the floor. They would draw things in the dust or the dirt. They would share recipes. They would sing. She was very musical, as were some of her friends. So they would sing and harmonize. They were just trying to pass the time. But you weren't free to come and go out of the barracks. You had to wait until you were called to line up again, go out in the yard, line up 5 abreast to be counted. Say lapel, you had to be counted. And then they were just taking account of everybody at all times back into the barracks. One day they asked if there were any artists among them. My mother did not raise her hand, but others did, and they were given something that looked like a pen, but they were to make tattoos. And all of the women received tattoos. And my mom, when she described her tattoo on her arm, she said, I was lucky because my person who did the tattoo was a real artist, and the numbers and letters were small and they were lined up nicely. She said other people's tattoos were big or crooked or whatever. So she said she had a nice one. She said from that point forward, we were not ever addressed by our name, but only our numbers. And day after day, they were there. Just any semblance of humanity was just stripped away. We just were numbers, and we weren't even humans. We were just commodities at that point. One day they did come again for them to go to work, and then finally, and Gita said, no, they're in quarantine. And they said, nope, no longer. And they did take them to work. She described having to walk down these pathways with the electrical barbed wire on either side. And they had to walk a long way to a part of the camp that they called Canada. And she learned later that was because the saying in the time was Canada, the land of plenty. And that was when they would where they were more like warehouses, and they would walk into the barracks there or the buildings there, and that's where they were taking people's clothing that they took from them upon arrival, and they would pile the clothing there, or the eyeglasses or the artificial limbs or crutches or whatever, and sort it there. And I'll tell you more about my mom's job in just a bit. But that's what they would do daily. In addition, you could not just go to the bathroom when you needed to. You had to wait until there were enough people in the barracks or in your workplace or whatever, and then they would take you as a group. And I wanted to show you what that looked like. My mom was very optimistic, and she said even though these horrible, terrible conditions, she really relied on her wonderful memories of her childhood for her strength. She loved the sun, and this was a repeated theme with her and her experience during the year. She just loved being outside in the sun. And so even though it was terrible, awful conditions, she appreciated the the beauty, the natural beauty of the world, of the sun, of nature, and of her wonderful childhood. This is what the bathroom looked like. Now, this was 50 years later. There's my mom, 50 years after her liberation, and her four daughters. And she said, but it looked very similar. Probably not as broken down on the front there, but she said it was a long cement slab with holes in it, and the girls just had to sit along those holes and go to the bathroom, and no privacy. That was it. And then on the wall in German, something that said, keep quiet, and just follow, something that translated, be orderly, kind of. And then it's a very strange but aside that I'm going to share with you, but it's very interesting to me. When we were there 50 years later, standing in this bathroom, Mom said, and there was an oven, and we, the daughters, we started to become horrified when we hear the word oven. And she said it was more like it was a cooking stove and oven, and somebody was making bread in there. And we had a historian, a docent who worked at Auschwitz, who was accompanying us on this trip, in this 50-year later trip. And we all looked at the historian like, is our mom losing it? There was somebody making bread in the bathroom. And the historian affirmed my mom's memories. She said, yes, there was. There was a privilege for being in charge of the bathroom. This person asked if they could please have an oven because they wanted to bake bread and the ingredients. And so they did. They didn't share it with the girls, of course, but that was very strange to me. But it does show that there were certain people in charge oftentimes Jewish people, but they were given certain privileges for doing certain jobs. Mom was told, when you are in these bathrooms, don't tell anyone if you have diarrhea. Don't let anyone know if you are sick, because this is what Gita told them, you will end up in that smoke. And she pointed to a tall chimney constantly smoking. My mom had no idea what she was talking about. What smoke, what chimneys, what are we even talking about? But she understood the danger of becoming sick or ill or not being able to work or too skinny. My mom was petite and she was small to begin with. So she really did lose a lot of weight and was at risk. Every day they had to go outside and stand multiple times a day, oftentimes for hours at a time, in the cold, in the heat, depending on the season, to be counted. And then they would go back in. But there were special times, certain times, where they would have to come up and line up. And those were called selections. And those selections, if you were selected and taken away, you were never seen again. And so she put two and two together and realized that there was danger in being selected, and you would go to, she did not know where, but end up in smoke. So that was a problem. She talked about some instances where she was at risk during those selections. One in particular, she talks about a scenario where she now had lost a lot of weight. She was very skinny and she knew she was at danger. So they were lined up for this selection. And this time there was a Nazi soldier, whatever, person who was sitting on one area and another one sitting across, but many steps away. And the girls had to take their clothes off and walk naked between these two. And if you were selected or not selected, that's where the decision would be made. Well, her turn was coming close in line, and she was at danger of being selected. And so she just thought for a quick moment, there were these two newcomers among them, these two sisters who had more recently arrived, so they still had a lot of weight between them. And they were sisters with very nice bodies. My mom said those two Nazis were very distracted by those two girls. And my mom, just in the nick of time, asked those two sisters, "Can I go between you?" And they said, "Sure, why not?" And so the first sister started to walk. And then before this, as the second sister started to walk, my mom just snuck through unnoticed somehow by the Nazis. And she was not selected that day. And she said, you never know when your life is in danger. You never know the ideas you have, the things you would try that you wouldn't otherwise. It was just one of those things that happened, and there were several that happened to her, and she ended up making it. This is her again 50 years later, but showing us what those electrical barbed wire fences look like. She's not touching it in this photo. She could not bring herself to touch it because she said then there were girls who were so desperate because they were either starving or, like my mother said, there was never a minute in any day or any night where you felt safe. You always were scared every moment of every day. You did not know what was going to happen. And some girls gave up and they touched on purpose. They touched that electrical barbed wire fence and they were electrocuted instantly. They ended their life just on purpose. So she couldn't bring herself to touch it. So back in her work camp, her work barrack, that was called Canada, was where they brought some of the clothes. This is not a picture of that. This is on the men's side in Auschwitz. This was taken 50 years after her liberation. If anyone has visited Auschwitz, you will recognize this pile of shoes in the on the men's side, which is really more like an educational or a museum type of arrangement that they've set up in part of the men's side of Auschwitz. But on the women's side in Birkenau, and in her barrack, what her job was with her mates from her barrack, their job was to take those clothing that were confiscated from people upon arrival, and they were given dull scissors, and she said they had to cut through those strips of clothing, and for the purpose they would take those clothing strips, braid them, and then roll them up into balls. And they were told that those strips of braided clothing were used to by the Nazis, by the military, to as fuses to light their bombs. So that was their job. And she said, occasionally when we cut through people's clothing, you would find items in their pockets or items of things that they sewed into their hems. Remember, when they were taken, they didn't know where they would be going, how long they would be gone. So maybe somebody put some valuables in their pockets or sewed them into their hems. My mom found a couple of things that she kept. If she would have been caught with them, it would have been the end of her. But one was an American dollar that she folded up and put in her mouth. And another was a little silver spoon, like either a baby silver spoon or one that you would get if you were, a tourist and you travel somewhere. It was like that size of a spoon, and she kept that. One day when they were at work, one of the girls started screaming and crying and said, "What?" And she was cutting up clothing, and she said, "These were Giza's clothing." And it's true. Giza had been found out that she had been protecting her girls from having to work sooner, and she was eliminated. She was murdered because of the favoritism that she showed to her groups. So that was a very sad day for them. There was another time. This is a photo of my mom 50 years after her liberation, looking on the Auschwitz site again, which was set up a little bit more like a museum at one of those ovens. But she knew now, of course, that this is where people after they died would be placed in the ovens, and that's what was the source of that smoke, constantly smoking. What she didn't know at the time was how people were being killed. And there was one instance when she and her girls that she was with were taken into the showers. They occasionally would take them into the showers. It was a big cement room with some shower heads. And she said, we just got squished in there and we would crowd under it and the water would come out in a sprinkle. She said, but it felt good. And so she liked the showers. One time they threw this very odd soap at them that she did not like, so she didn't use the soap. But one day they went into one of those cement rooms and they were just waiting for the water to be turned on, all squished in there waiting. And the water didn't come. And one girl among them started crying and crying. And they said, "Why are you crying?" And this woman said, "I heard sometimes water doesn't come out, but gas does. And then everybody dies." Well, that scared everyone. So all the girls started crying and they pulled against the wall out of fear. And a man came down the stairs. He was the man who was in charge of the showers. He was the one who had taken their clothes, like they always do. And then he came down and he said, "Why are you crying?" And one girl said, "We don't want to take a shower today." And he closed the door and he left. And then he came back with all of their dresses, and they put their dresses on and they left. And we asked the historian when we were there 50 years later, "Is this possible? Why did this happen?" And the historian said, yes. First of all, the Germans were very superstitious. The Nazis felt that if people knew that they were going to be killed, then we wouldn't kill them. One of the reasons the historian said to us during our trip was that the Nazis knew they were far outnumbered by the people who were held in detention in these concentration camps, that if there were to be an uprising, they would be outnumbered. Now, they were the ones with the guns, but still, they could have been overcome. When people are desperate, they know they're at the end of their life, they can find the strength, both physical and emotional, to do what they would not do otherwise. So likely this man who was in charge of this gas chamber would have gone and told someone, and they made the decision not to turn on the gas. So she was returned back to their barracks in that regard. Time went on like this for a long, long time. And one day, she was very skinny at this point, but one day, a order came for them to line up 5 abreast. And this time they started walking, and they walked outside the gate. So, the Arbach macht frei, work makes free. They left that gate and they found themselves out in the countryside of the town in Poland where they were. And they walked on a dirt road, and there were farms and occasional houses along the road, and they didn't know where they were going, but they were told, "Keep up or you'll get shot." Well, my mom was very small, very skinny at that point. And so it was very difficult to do this, but she tricked herself and she said, "Okay, I'm going to hurry up to the front of the line, and then I can rest a little, keep walking, but rest until I get near, but not to the very end of the line because I don't want to get shot, and then run up again." And she did that as long as she could. They ended up sleeping in some of those barn houses along the way, but eventually ended up on, again, the train car. But this time they were open cattle cars, and they squeezed into the cattle cars and didn't know where they were going, didn't know where they'd be taken, but it was open air. When they woke up in the morning, they were covered with snow. And my mother said, she, no food, no water. Again, 3 days, 2 nights, waking up with snow on her. Do you remember that little spoon I told you she saved? She took that spoon and she started to scrape the snow off of her and eat it. She said her granny always told her, "Don't eat yellow snow. You just eat, clean snow." And so she took this, and she said she let it melt in her mouth, and it was water, and she enjoyed it. Well, that train car ended up at another camp. It was called Bergen-Belsen, and there the conditions got even worse. They really stopped getting any kind of meal. They were given a turnip to share with the whole barrack of girls, but by then her own body weight was so low, her nutrition If you know about malnutrition, one of the things that goes is the bone support for your teeth. So her teeth were wobbling. She said they wobbled in my mouth. She couldn't bite the turnip anymore. She wanted other people to have it. There, the conditions were very bad. They stopped shaving their hair. So um, one of those bugs that are in your hair, those with lice were just crawling all over everybody, and people were getting sick. And she was really quite in a bad way. There were girls that would die during the night, and they would drag them out and put them out in front of the window, stack them up, and pretty soon the stack was so high that light wasn't coming in through the window anymore. And one day she described lying there, and going in and out of what she called a deep sleep, and being conscious enough to think, wait a minute, nothing hurts. Nothing hurts at the moment, and I'm not scared. I'm at peace. And she said, wait, is this the way people die? She was asking herself this. And no sooner than that, the door opened and a man with a beret peeked in and then closed it again. And she thought, who dares to interrupt my peaceful sleep that I'm having here? And then he came back and he spoke English. And do you remember she had English lessons? She understood him. He said, the war is over and you are going to be liberated. She didn't know who these people were, but that's what she heard. There had been shooting and jeeps and loud noises outside. And so when things quieted down, she couldn't walk at that point, but she crawled and got herself outside into the sun. She didn't want to get sunburned, so she lied down under a bush, but stick her legs out into the sun. And she said, my legs look like toothpicks covered with skin. She was 22 years old and weighed 47 pounds at that point. And so then when her friends asked her, what are you going to do now? And she said, I want to go home. I want to go back to Sighet. And they said, you can't. Look at yourself. You can't even walk. So there were ambulance drivers, and they put her on a stretcher. They took her to Sweden, where they had converted schools into makeshift hospitals, and then from there moved them to rehabilitation places, a living place, where it took her a long time before she could put on weight. And she was a very picky eater. So even in that state of starvation, if she didn't like something, she wouldn't eat it or she wouldn't try it, which we now know could be one of the things that was the best choice she could have made, because she saw women in the camp they turned Bergen-Belsen into a DP camp, and women who could walk raided the refrigerators and ate, and their systems weren't used to that kind of amount of food coming in, and they died. So she had a slow recovery, but you know what got her? She had to learn how to walk again. What got her out of bed? From her position on her pillow, if her door was open, she could look down the hall, and there was a room with a piano, and she's at the piano at the end of the hall. So she got herself in time to go down there and be able to play that piano. There was one man who was allowed to come into that all women facility, and he was a photographer. He was part of that effort to help reunite families with their family members, survivors with their family members. And the Red Cross, was a huge part of that. And of course, they didn't have internet, they didn't have databases. So they were using photographs to try. So he was allowed to come in, take a photograph. And out of 100 women in there, he took a fancy to my mom, and they would go on walks in the garden later in the evenings. And there was a girlfriend who would go with them because my mom spoke Hungarian and my dad spoke German, but this girlfriend spoke both. And so she was their translator. On one of those walks, he said to the girl to tell my mom, yeah, I could spend the rest of my life with her. And then my mom translated back, I could spend the rest of my life with him. So her hope was that, she would get married and raise a family. And she did. She made it. She was 23 years old, just like her mom said. They were married in Sweden. A wonderful family was like a sponsor, a host family to them. They lived with them for some time, just for until they could arrange passage to the United States. My dad's brother had already made it to the United States. There were only certain sanctuary cities that were taking according to quota, and they ended up in the area outside of Portland, Oregon. And eventually it didn't take long for them to move into Portland. And then my mother had been told by doctors she would never have kids because of the amount of weight that she lost. Well, in 1950, they immigrated to the US in 1948 and 1950. She had my first sister, Evie, and then the other two followed. And I was an afterthought. I'm not even in this picture. I'm a glimmer in their eyes. And my parents had to learn the new language. They had to get jobs. They had to raise their family in this new country without extended family help. And so they had to learn how to live their life again. My mom credits my dad because he told her, don't live with hatred. It will eat you up from the inside. And so she said, okay. And she really learned to just, be a great mom. And they just had what I, viewed as a family, not too different from my friends' families growing up in Portland, Oregon. What I didn't know at first was that she was writing her memories first in writing because she didn't want to lose her good memories of her childhood. So she would write first in Hungarian, then later in English as her English got better. And then she had stopped at the point of her wonderful childhood memories. And then she asked herself, should I keep writing? And she said, I guess I will. And so she wrote about her experiences being taken inside the concentration camps and then afterwards. And she was done. She just put it in a pile of papers and that was it. But when we were all adult children, she had them typed up. My cousin, who was a child taken on Kristallnacht and then came to the United States, so she was not in a concentration camp. So she really grew up here in the United States and was college educated, said to my mom, I'll type these up for you if you'd like to and edit them. And she did. And then at one point, this is my mom and the four daughters during that same trip and 50 years afterward. Because what happened was my mom wrote her memoirs, which eventually got published into a book. And she just wanted to make sure that everything she said in her book was accurate. This was 50 years after it happened. She said, I want to go back to the concentration camps. I want to go back to my home. And this is her hometown, her favorite synagogue in her hometown. But you can see in the upper right, on the ceiling. There's a hole in the ceiling, and birds were just coming in and out. There were not enough Jewish people to sustain this as an active congregation. Out of her town in Sighet, I believe 2,000 Jews, only 200 survived and returned. So what happened was she did not intend to have a book, but she ended up with a book. We ended up with the video documentary 50 years after her liberation. She was very dedicated to remembrance and the importance of remembering. And so she had this rubber stamp. She first would handwrite it, but then this rubber stamp that said the legacy of the Holocaust should never be forgotten. Students would line up after her talk to receive a copy of her book, and she always thanked them for being interested and helping to carry on the memory. Why? So that it should never happen again. She went further than that in both of the towns that she lived in her life in the United States, Portland, Oregon, and then retired in Palm Desert, actually moved back to Portland. And in both of those areas, she rallied the survivor communities in these areas and said, we need to leave something for future generations. And also we, the survivors, don't have a place to go, like a cemetery, to remember our loved ones. We need a place like that. And so in both of those cities, she helped plant the seeds, and the right people came together to make it happen. My sister in the background in the Oregon Holocaust Memorial was very instrumental in working with the survivors to preserve their voice in the planning with the city, with the neighbors who resisted it the whole way, and getting this done. It's beautiful if you ever have a chance. And they both are, but the Portland one is just very moving if you have a chance ever in Portland, Oregon, in Washington Park to go visit that. And then this is a picture that my son just sent a couple weeks ago. He's on foreign exchange and he just graduated high school last year, is taking a gap year on foreign exchange in France. And his geopolitical class went to the Holocaust museum in Paris, and he took this picture. I thought it was lovely. And just tying it to Elie Wiesel and the importance of remembrance. And the key word in Elie's quote here for me was consequences. The consequences if we remember or if we don't remember. And I'll just close with a few of my own, since I have been given a platform, into my own words and thoughts about how to navigate the relevance of remembering the Holocaust today. And I don't know if any of you had the opportunity to hear Barack Obama's words that he delivered at Jesse Jackson's recent funeral, but I heard it when I was in the moment anyway, trying to plan for this talk and for my Kansas City talk about how to tie it to today. What is the relevance? And when Barack Obama was talking about it's hard to have hope, and it's so easy for me to just want the storm to pass and hope and hope and hope. And I thought that's something's missing. That doesn't feel like, hope is wonderful, but there's got to be, I personally need more of a plan. And so I looked a little bit more, and I'm thinking, if I had a path to follow, if I had some plan to follow, and I found these words compelling. And actually, my son really inspired me, because I don't know if it's just him, but I've heard others of his generation. They're really trying to make an active effort to combat today's chaos and hatred, and replace it with compassion. And if we could be compassionate toward one another, and these words, if you're compassionate to others, you find inner strength. And if you have inner strength, you have determination, you have less fear of the obstacles that are in your way. So then I felt this quote: a goal without a plan is just a wish, that was missing for me. It's some kind of a plan. How can I show compassion, strength, find that determination, and ultimate success? It's still elusive. I'm still working on it, but it feels like the right thing to come from a place of compassion to help, you know, influence others to do the same. But it can be simpler than that. One time, my sisters and I were on a Zoom, not unlike this one, with 8 combined high schools in rural Western Kansas. And we shared our mom's story. And one of the students said in the question and answer period, how do we do this? How do I know how to do this? I don't know what to do. I want to prevent it. And my sister said, "Oh, that's easy. There's 2 things that come to mind. First is the Constitution that says we're all created equal. And then she said to the student, do you remember the golden rule?" And I said, at that point, if more people during my mom's time and my dad's time and everyone else's times leading up to the Holocaust could have just remembered and acted on the golden rule and said, no, that's not right. What are we doing? Orchestrating this, mass genocide. No, that's not right. So again, a goal without a plan is just that. I'll end with one last quote, and this was what my mom had said to students. She said that, that's all I ask is that you become educated, you learn about this time, and that you do your part in trying to make this a better world. I'll end here. I know I'm long-winded. I appreciate the opportunity to have a chance to go into depth into some of these details. But I want to ask you if you have any questions about my mother's story. I might not know the answers, but I will entertain any questions. I will say what my mom said. I'm not a historian. I'm not a politician, but I know tidbits of her story, and I would be so happy to answer any questions if you have any.
Thank you, Geri. That was wonderful. We recently we work with the Bach Museum here in town, and we had a discussion with the education director. They had just given a tour, and a student said, "Hope is an action." And I personally just really thought that was very powerful, and your talk very much provides us with hope and with the idea of doing better. My question is, I'm getting to ask the first one. For your mother, when she understand like not touching the fence, I totally understand that.
Yeah.
How was the experience for her with going back to Auschwitz? The idea too that
Yeah.
most people did not get the opportunity to walk out, but then going back 50 years later and having walking in and walking out.
Yeah, wonderful question. We were so honored, my 3 sisters and I, and also understood the historical significance of her going back. So we brought a videographer with us and filmed a documentary. And I say that because I would say for my mother's reaction, how was she? She was the strongest among all of us. And I think here's why. First and foremost, it was validation to her. It was validating. It had been 50 years. I honestly can't remember what I had for dinner last week. This was 50 years later, and she was malnourished and under trauma, yet she wrote these things in her book. And I actually just learned last week when my sisters flew in for the Kansas City event that it was my older sister's idea to go back 50 years later. She said, why? Because mom was getting to that point where she was sensing her own mortality. And she said, I won't be able to tell my story in classrooms much longer. Or forever, I want to tell my story from the very place that it took place. And so it was very validating for her to go back to meet with those historians, to validate that what she wrote in the book was true and factual. and that she was able to tell her story on set. My mother was amazing when she was in front of an audience or when the camera rolled. She had presence and she was in the moment and telling her story. And so I think that energized her. She had a purpose for being there. She was very strong. There was the rest of us, my sisters and I, were bawling most of the time. There were times where we cried so much we laughed. You know, we had to excuse ourselves, but she was the strong one. There was one time I saw her, two times that she cried on that trip. One was one of the intentions was to go to one of the bombed out crematoria where her mom could have been, her mom and her two little cousins, and we lit a candle. And she cried then. And then another time was when we were in Bergen-Belsen, which the Germans were very, very good record keepers. And there was a book of all of the people who had died there. And she looked through and found her best friend, one of those girls in the pictures, her name. And she cried then. All the other times, she was the strong one. What other question?
Is the documentary available for us to view?
Mm-hmm.
Love to.
Yes, I can share. My sisters and I created a very modest website for our mom, and the book and the video are available there.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Geri, I want to thank you, and I'm so glad that you were able to share it with us, and I'm so glad that you're now a part of our Omaha and Kansas City community. But and we both were talking about Creighton is such a wonderful place, and so again, thank you for being here. Next month, Kelly Tischauer Kirk is going to be sharing more information on her research on intergenerational trauma, the work she did as a 2G in understanding her own family and others, and on the work she did for her master's degree. So I hope you'll all be able to join us for that. And Geri, again, thank you so much for letting us to get to know your family. And I hope this is the first of many times that we'll be able to have you as a part of our community. Correction, that I'm sorry, I said Kelly is a 3G. Her all four of her grandparents were survivors. 1% of people had that, where all four grandparents were survivors. So pretty interesting.
Wow, that is great. Thank you. I hope that we also have that this is the first of many conversations we have, and hope is in action.
Great. Yes. Thank you all for being here. We'll see you next month.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.